And joining us now on the debate in San Diego, California, Paul Kedrosky, Senior Fellow at the Kauffman Foundation and editor of the financial blog Infectious Greed. In Durham, North Carolina, Dan Ariely, Professor of Behavioral Economics at Duke University and the author of Predictably, Irrational. In Boston, Massachusetts, Kenneth Rogoff, Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University and the author of This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. And here in our studios in Toronto, Diane Francis, editor-at-large of the National Post and distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University's Rogers School of Management. Diane, Happy New Year. Nice to have you back on the program. We have a couple of folks out of town, Paul and Dan, who've been on the program before. Nice to see you two again. And Kenneth, your first time on, so we're putting you to work right away. We're talking tonight about the discipline of economics, how economists do their thing, come to their conclusions, make their predictions, their forecasts, their measurements. So why don't you start us off by just giving us your basic Economics 101 basic definition of what economics is or are, whatever the correct verb is here.
Well, I think we're not very good at forecasting and by and large don't hold ourselves out to be. That's really the realm of business economists and specialists in forecasts who are really using different methodologies. I speak of academic economists. That said, I do think we try to understand when systems are broadly unsustainable, when there are imbalances that just can't continue. And we don't pretend to be able to say when the timing of that is, but if a country's borrowing a lot, if asset prices like housing and stocks are just shooting through the moon, we do have models that suggest it won't last.
The discipline of economics, Diane, when you refer to that, what are you talking about?
Well, I don't think there's much discipline in a lot of among the many practitioners. I think that the public is exposed to economists that are really thinly disguised spin doctors. I mean, you get the chief economist from a trade labor union looking at the same set of financial data and the economic condition, and you'll get a bank chief economist, and they're both coming to different conclusions and different extrapolations as to what will happen. I think forecasting, as Professor Rogoff said, is not the bailiwick of economists, even though they like to do it.
Paul, how exact a science is this inexact science?
Well, it's not exact, and I think it's a social science. I think, as you said at the outset, which is kind of a get out of jail free card, and in part, just to segue back to something Diane said, there's an old joke in economics that the reason why economists make predictions is because people ask them to, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But to turn it around again in terms of the exactness, I mean, economics is really, and this is stealing a little bit of Dan's thunder, is a little bit of the psychology of money, and one of the core ideas is that people respond to incentives, and people respond in an aggregate, economies respond in an aggregate, in some sense, nations respond. And it's all about how we respond and when we respond. And the problem economics has developed over time is that it's traded off its ability to actually model things and make them computationally tractable for the relevancy of the models. And that disconnect is an awful lot of where the discipline has gone wrong.
Dan, I remember once talking to a former Premier of Ontario, a guy named William Davis, who was Premier for 14 years in the 70s and 80s. And I was asking him about political science, and he said, I don't know why they call it political science. It's way more art than science. Let me ask you the same thing about economics. Is it more art than science also?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, sorry. I don't think it's art. I actually don't think there's a much artistic aspect of it, but I do think that the answers everybody else before me gave were kind of wimpy answers. Look, the reality is that if you talk to serious economists, they would all say that economics kind of tells you very little, and most of the models predict like 5-10% of the variance, maybe 15 if they're lucky, that it's about general principles. But that's not how economists are selling economics. And if you open an economics 101 textbook, or you go to a class, or you say, why have economists been so successful in getting everybody to believe in economics, right? And it's because they really are selling us a book of goods which says that they can actually predict, and they have the model, and they have the right model, and you don't need anything else to understand life outside of economics. So it's true that when you kind of push them to the wall and you say, really, do you believe that? They would say, no, we're just saying that. But the fact is that the reason that they're saying it is because it's been very good for economics. Think about it. Economics de facto has become the social science of choice. It's everywhere. It's in the government. You have a degree in economics. You have lots of things you could do. Lots of people think you have some valuable skill. Now, the reality is you might not, and you probably don't. But this is not how they sell it. So there are two levels of economics. There's how economics really is, and most good economists understand how limited it is. And then there is the way that economists sell economics to the rest of the world, which is a simplified version and saying we have all the answers. And I think that's basically has been the mistake.
Hold on for a second there, Dan, because you've thrown the gauntlet down, and I want to offer Diane a chance to get way more macho in her answer, because obviously Dan thought you wimped out the first time around, and all the rest of you. So go ahead. You want to take a second kick at this?
Well, if you become an economist, you can become Prime Minister of Canada and get it all wrong a lot of the time. No, I think that what's important is economics does identify, it tags, it's a form of, it's a tool to measure the past and the present, which is totally valid. But, you know, call it animal spirit psychology, behavioral economics. People do not act in their own rational best interests a lot of the time. Schiller wrote Irrational Exuberance. And in fact, it was very interesting that the economists of Britain apologized to the government and the public for not forecasting what was going to happen in the meltdown. So I think the whole tea leaf reading aspect of it is wrong. I think Paul is really correct in saying it's a great career choice because you can go into a lot of different lucrative positions, whether it's politics or journalism or the financial sector.
But Ken Rogoff, given the performance of most economists, I guess Nouriel Roubini being the most obvious example of a guy who didn't follow the pack and I guess got the financial crisis quite right, would you say the discipline of economics is broken right now?
Look, I mean, I think the previous two speakers have concentrated on a certain aspect of what economics does. I mean, differently, but, you know, in forecasting, I think academic economists would not pretend to be very good, although we, I think, do have a lot to say about when things aren't sustainable. And in my book with Carmen Reinhart, This Time is Different, looking at 8 centuries of financial crises, you can say a lot about when things are unsustainable. And we've been writing for years now that the U.S. was unsustainable, and it was, and why. But that's not why economics is so successful. It's much broader than that. It's not just about picking stocks. It's more about understanding policy. Do free markets work better than the government? When do they? What do you need the government for? How should you design regulation? I mean, when I was an undergraduate a long time ago, people were debating if communism would outstrip the United States. Look, people today are debating whether the Chinese approach will someday defeat the Western approach, being a superior way of organizing things. And by the way, I guarantee you they will have their financial crisis at some point. There are these much broader philosophical issues where it's been spectacularly successful and really very influential in the 20th century. And it's not all about forecasting, you know, where some stock price goes.
No, I understand. Dan, you want to come back at that?
I don't see any spectacular success. I think how the success has been that economists have been getting their students to have very good jobs on Wall Street and in Washington and in very big places, a very wonderful success for the profession of academics. But I don't see the big successes in prediction. In fact, if you take a group of people who are really well trained in economics and have taken, you know, game theory 702, and you put them against a few people who studied psychology and sociology, show me a study that showed that they can actually predict better. Now, some economists are very smart people. And you take smart people and you put them in a room and you ask them to predict, they can predict very nice things. But there's nothing inherent about the economic fundamental assumptions, about the assumptions of rationality that make you better able to predict than people who haven't studied game theory, for example.
Let me get Paul and Diane on this.
There's a confusion here.
Okay, Paul, then Diane on this. You want to break the tie on that, Paul?
No, I'm nodding in agreement here. I mean, you know, as I said, and I don't disagree with Ken that, I mean, I think the whole notion of economists as prediction engines is kind of a wrong path in the first place. So let's not even go there. The thing I have more trouble with is, you know, let's go back to the level of the big successes and maybe talk at the level of individual policies. you know, the examples to point to, say, for example, in the U.S. regulatory system, some of the greatest failures in the U.S. system over the last 3 or 4 years have obviously been in the most tightly regulated sections of the economy. The most loosely regulated areas of the economy have had a much lower rate of failure. Pick on hedge funds if you want. And so the problem, I think, for people who want to point to economics as a great fountain of sort of regulatory authority in the context of how you run a proper market system and how you make sure that you avoid the kinds of cascading failures we saw over the last 2 years, is that, you know, the facts kind of run against you.
Diane.
Yeah, I just think it's important also to point out that economics actually is derived from 2 Greek words that means rules of the house. So the importance of economics has been tagging, if I can use that internet term, and that is let's label things, let's count the numbers properly, let's know what's going on, and let's try and determine what the immutable laws, whether it's supply, demand, substitution, whatever, that we can uncover, which is helpful, as Professor Rogoff says, in policy making and in our own personal decisions.
Ken Rogoff, a follow-up?
And of which Ken's book's a fantastic example of that. So, to sell your book for a second, Ken, is a fantastic example of that. I mean, for anyone who hasn't read it, please run out and buy it immediately. I mean, this pulling together 800 years of data showing the inevitability of crises in sovereigns when they sort of roll up enough debt to reach the point where these failures become predictable. It's only a question of time. Shouldn't be eye-opening, but is, and it's dramatic whenever you see it assembled that way, and it can only be done that way, I think, by an authoritative economic study.
Okay, but please wait until we get finished with this program before everybody goes out and buys the book. Wait till 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Ken Rogoff, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, well, I mean, to look at just at the financial crisis, economists studied the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, had done wonderful work on it, and many others. What caused it? Why did it spread around the world? They looked at Japan. Why was Japan, in a hole for so long? What did they do wrong? And I'm not saying we got everything right. I think we made some mistakes. But I think we benefited a lot by looking at those experiences and interpreting them. I mean, I think in some ways, if you look at central bank policy, which they are really the engine that bailed us out, it benefited a lot from studying economics. Now, it wasn't just economics. There's political science in there, there's sociology. I mean, I wouldn't credit it all to economics. A lot of the understanding of the Great Depression really also involves politics. A lot of what's wrong with the system involves political science and other fields. But I do think we've learned something. We were able to get out of it better. But there was a lot of hubris, there's no doubt, and it included economists in the run-up to this.
Well, I think we all on this program respect The Economist magazine, and let me quote from the July 16th, 2009 edition, where they really summed it up pretty concisely on what their view of economics, classical economics was. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman feared that most macroeconomics of the past 30 years was, quote, spectacularly useless at best and positively harmful at worst. These internal critics argue that economists missed the origins of the crisis, failed to appreciate its worst symptoms, and cannot now agree about the cure. In other words, economists misread the economy on the way up, misread it on the way down, and now mistake the right way out. Let's go through some of these observations here. Essentially, 3 different points. Economists helped cause the crisis. They failed to spot it. They have no idea how to get out of it. Diane Francis, to you first. Economists help cause this crisis. True or false?
Well, no, not really. I don't think so. I think the economist is a social scientist, just like a psychologist, and they're diagnostic, and they don't all agree on diagnosis, and therefore they don't all agree on treatment. And I think it's simple as that. It's a difference of opinion. Some people don't measure things properly. Some people are purposely biased. Some people are ideological in their approach. So, I think that it really, I think they're tripping over each other. And I think one of the problems is our world, Steve, because I think we in the media, and I include myself, have trouble understanding a lot of this. And we do try and torque information and get it out of economists where it probably isn't appropriate. And we push it a little bit.
Dan, how about on that issue? Economists helped cause this crisis. You agree or disagree?
Absolutely. I think there's no question about it. In fact, the whole discussion here is kind of amazing to listen. I mean, here are people who are smart, intelligent, and are telling you that economics cannot predict anything, and therefore, at the same time, it's a science. What kind of science can't predict anything? It's a science that can only explain in retrospect what happened in the past. That's history. And if economists think that that's all they can do, that they should go to history department and get paid like history professors. Now, back to the question of, has economics caused this? Of course. If you look at the whole notion of how much we should regulate and how much we create, what kind of markets we create, and the trust that people paid to the market. I mean, the real culprit here is the fact that people thought that the market is always right. The invisible hand is working correctly. As long as we selfishly maximize our own incentive, everything will be right, and the general wisdom is going to prevail. And this is clearly not the case. And it's kind of an amazing thing that not everybody is understanding that this is just kind of a basic failure of some of the basic economic assumptions.
Paul, what's your view on whether economists helped cause the financial crisis?
Absolutely, but I mean, I think goes back to this point that if for no other reason than an inability to adequately influence sort of the regulatory discussion, and a favorite example being, what's happened with respect to regulatory capital and the ability to sort of escape from under the regulatory capital regulations that existed in the U.S. and elsewhere over the last 15 years, because I don't think there was an adequate understanding of this kind of, pro-cyclical force in the banking system that regulatory capital represented, and then as we sort of let it go down to lower and lower levels and increased leverage, that it wasn't that we were then prone to having individual bank failures, but we were prone to having this kind of complex, tightly coupled, systemic collapse. And I think the place to point the finger, obviously, is economics, in that our understanding of the causes and consequences of these kinds of collapses in financial systems, I think, have never been well understood, in part because of, I think, a fealty that was paid for a long, long time to this whole idea of the efficient market hypothesis that Dan alludes to, and that was wrong-headed from the beginning and dangerous in its implications.
Ken Rogoff, you on that one?
Well, I want to argue that I'm not saying we can't make predictions. We certainly can, and we do it well in terms of when systems are unsustainable.
But you shouldn't be held to
No,
it.
no. Listen, people, economists, leading economists, were talking for years, not just Nouriel Roubini, who really became a popular figure, but economists. We had conferences about the U.S. borrowing so much, it would lead to problems. There were all kinds of meetings of, the G7 ministers and later other groups, the IMF. Everybody was worried about it. And why didn't anything happen? Because the financial sector was making a lot of money.
Hang on, Dan, hang on. Let's hear him out. Sorry, Ken, we had two people speaking, and I didn't hear your point. Say it again, please.
Yeah, I mean, the financial system was very rich and became very influential and, caused this deregulation, really lobbied for it very hard. And I think there were a lot of voices, frankly, a lot of regulators all over the world were saying this was nuts and got crushed by their politicians.
Okay, Ken, if you don't want to say that economists caused it, can we say that they contributed to it?
I mean, it's a big group, and you certainly could find people to say that, things are fantastic and we can have things grow to the sky. But I wouldn't have argued that was a majority position. It's not the same as sort of, if you're going to take Wall Street economists as an example, I think that's really not representative of the science of economics.
Diane?
Yeah, I mean, the British economists apologized because they didn't see it coming. So they obviously felt that forecasting was part of what they should have fulfilled as a professional obligation. I really write down a lot of the failure, if you want to put it that way, among certain economists because they're high priests for certain religious beliefs, economic religious beliefs. I mean, the free markets, dereg, everything's good, it's all fine, the invisible hand, regulation is a problem, it's inefficient, people always do the rational thing. I mean, it's when I'm evaluating, quoting an economist, I know exactly where they're coming from based on who they're employed by. Or their biases because of their ideology. So I think that we have to really understand that they're spinning sometimes for profit and sometimes because of their belief system.
Dan, do you think classical economists have any idea how to fix the problem?
No, I don't, because I think that the problem wasn't originating in the small box of economic reasoning. And again, kind of going back to the point, there's the question of smart people who can predict and tell you things, and then there's a question of economics. And if you take somebody very smart, they can help you out to figure things, but it's not necessarily their economic training, and I think that's kind of part of the discussion. Are the people who are in the economics training, Are they all thinking that the market was going to do great? No, but their training, the part of their personality and understanding that came from standard economics, that part of them believe that things are going to be good. And I think that the same problem is it's not going to help it now, because the reason that we failed was that we didn't take lots of irrationalities into account. And irrationalities are just outside of the economics box, outside of that frame of thinking. So using more tools within that toolbox is just not going to get us out of it. We need to understand the irrational aspects of people's behavior. We need to understand how people distort information. We need to understand how conflict of interest shape people's opinions. And only by understanding those things that are outside of standard economics, I think we can actually come up with solutions.
Ken Rogoff, do you have some time in that big heart of yours for some of the theories of behavioral economics as Dan Ariely is enunciating?
I mean, I certainly think modern economics embraces behavioral economics and looking for regularities. It's a very young science, behavioral economics. So, I mean, I think so far there are a lot of interesting examples. But, I mean, they're very concrete things here. If we talk about what went wrong, there was a lot of short-term debt in the system that had to constantly get rolled over. These banks were borrowing trillions of dollars one day, overnight. And what kind of surprise is it that, you know, someday they lose confidence and have trouble refinancing, and we have a crisis when the governments make clear they're not going to back everything. And yes, I've looked at 8 centuries of financial crises with my co-author Carmen Reinhardt. This is utterly a unifying characteristic. Each time in the run-up, people say, this time is different. We have financial globalization. We're in Asia. We have Asian values. We're in Latin America. We have commodities. We're doing things better. But there's this threat of it, of this massive short-term borrowing. We have the subprime borrowers here. And eventually it collapses. And that's what the regulation has to get at. All this other stuff may be important, but if you don't stop that, it will happen again, and it'll happen again soon, in 10 or 15 years.
Well, follow up on that. Even in Toronto. Ken, follow up on that if you would a bit, because if you've chronicled how over 8 centuries we still make the same damn mistake time and time and time and time again, who's not listening out there?
Well, I think people do listen, so it's a matter of, do you have a crisis every 15 years like Venezuela, or do you stretch it out, you know, much longer? I mean, Canada actually has a remarkable record of not defaulting on its sovereign debt. You've certainly suffered from financial crises over the years. But some countries have a lot more problems, a lot more frequently. It's embedded in, I think, the political dynamic. Latin America's had terrible problems, but my goodness, Spain's defaulted on its foreign debt 13 times. Greece has been in default on its debt half the time since it was independent in 1829. There are different systems, I think, manage to adjust to these risks better. You don't want to control things so much that you never have a crisis. There's no creativity. But you want to have it every 75 years and not every 10 or 15. That's the issue today. Well, we're not going to have a crisis in 2 years, but will we have one in 10 or 15?
Sorry, who was trying to get in there? Go ahead, Paul.
That was me. So to that point, I mean, and this is part of the problem is that, you know, standing there in the vantage point of 2004, I was wandering around saying that, you know, real estate, the acceleration in real estate prices in California had all the hallmarks of a bubble. And if you had at that point put on the kind of trade that John Paulson famously did and, you know, made himself $1 billion going massively short a subprime in various forms, you would have lost your shirt and lost all your money for your investors. And the reason, of course, is the famous quote, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So part of the problem from the standpoint of understanding that economic cycles exist and they can lead to crises and they can be fueled by massive amounts of short-term debt is our inability to time these things, and knowing how much is too much leads to this kind of blithe behavior where people say, I don't know how long is too long, but I can race to the exit faster than the next person. And all that means is that everyone hangs in and hangs in and hangs in and loads up and takes more and more risk until when the inevitable failure comes, it's catastrophic. And then we have the situation like in the last 2 years, which goes back to the point that if we can't allow people to get to that point and lever up so much that the failure becomes catastrophic, then we need to have much more sort of negatively biased regulation that dampens the cycle such that you can never get to that point.
Diane.
I think some other factors are at play here. I think there's real-time information now. There's a global economy. People are reacting or not reacting immediately. There's a lot more moving parts in the world economy. There's a lot of different players now from different economic, religious cultures, if I can put that kind of spin on it. So I think that there's all kinds of information out there as to what went wrong, but are they reading them in other cultures, or theocrats that are technocrats that are running China? Are they reading it? Do they really understand? Are they trying to change things? So I think that it is a new world, and I think that's why our crises are happening more frequently.
Dan, let me just push you a little bit on the classical economists and what they have to contribute at the moment. We have this double whammy of an economic recession plus the near meltdown a year or so ago of the financial system. Do you think classical economists have nothing to contribute going forward on getting us out of this kind of double whammy?
So, it's not that they have nothing to contribute. This would be clearly wrong. I mean, economics gives something into the picture, but I think the right way to view economics is describing part of human nature. I mean, we can argue about what's the size of that part, but it describes only a part of human nature. And to create a real system that actually helps us overcome our difficult nature and regulate markets and reducing instability, we need to take other things into account. So, the problem with economics is not that economics is inherently wrong. Every social science has kind of blind spots. Economics has blind spots like every other social science, but economics is so imperialistic that they've been saying, we are the only thing that matters. Outside of understanding this simple model that we're going to give you and price things according to that and create rules and regulation according to that, you don't need anything else. No other social scientist has the guts, the gall to tell you that. They say, we understand part of it, and there's lots of other parts that you don't understand. So I think that's the way to view economics. It's going to give you part of the picture, but you need sociology, you need psychology, you need other parts in order to understand and figure out how to create this. And if you think about it, it's really incredible. Think about Wall Street. We paid billions of dollars to these supposedly really smart people to figure things out, and all they were supposed to do is to figure things out, and most of them have failed in spectacular ways. I mean, what does it tell you about the wisdom of all of those people? They all had incredible computational models and computing power, and they're all using fantastic algorithms, hiring some of the best physicists around the world to help them figure these things out. And it was what? How useful was it? Not really. I mean, so how can you say that this system that collapsed in such a magnificent way represents some important and useful aspect that we should build on for the next version of the stock market?
Let me get Ken to comment on that. Was there too much emphasis and reliance on the so-called hard science that Dan just pointed out?
Well, unfortunately, the people in Wall Street, by and large, have done very well. They took away their profits. I mean, there was a small generation that really lost money. But by and large, look, Goldman Sachs had a record year this year. They got bailed out by the rest of it. No, they understood the system really well. The fault was with the regulators. The fault was with the politicians, because they need to look further. And if people are saying, look, housing markets are great, but they're not going to double every year for 20 years. Stock prices aren't going to keep going up like this. You can't keep borrowing money like this. I can't tell you when it's going to end, but it will. And the politicians especially say, well, is it going to end on my watch? I'm out in 2 years. I don't care. And that's where I think you really run into trouble. We need institutions that are longer looking, like central banks, that will tighten regulation. And here's where Canada did well. I mean, frankly, you didn't have such heavy regulation, but compared to the United States, it was draconian. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the worst business, really the most dangerous business, went to the United States. That's part of how you stayed safe. If you do build up your financial market, I think it'll be important not just to avoid weakening regulation, but to make it stronger.
Okay, we've got less than 10 minutes to go here, and let's spend some time on perhaps offering some advice to policymakers who may in fact be watching us tonight. If you're dealing with something, Diane, to you first, you're dealing with something as complicated as the job market in a modern industrialized country, can we say with relative certainty that by lowering interest rates and ramping up stimulus spending, you will necessarily get the kind of result that, of course, every politician in the Western world, it seems at the moment, well, everywhere in the world for that moment, thinks we're going to get? Lower unemployment, happy times are here again, that kind of thing.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you lower interest rates but don't control how people deploy the capital or that they borrow, you end up fueling speculation and creating even more bubbles. So, to the point of the other speakers, I mean, you have to take into consideration the psychology of the marketplace and the regulatory framework. You can't listen to libertarians who say, oh, just, damn the torpedoes, lower interest rates, spend money, print money, and everything is going to be fine because that's the American system. It doesn't work, and it hasn't worked, and regulation is needed. Otherwise, it's a hockey game without a referee.
Those are some of the most fun, though, those games.
I guess.
Perhaps not
I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
A lot of bruises.
Maybe not if your pensions are dependent upon it. Paul, why don't you come in on that? The whole world seems to be taking the approach right now, keep the interest rates low, stimulus spend like crazy, although Krugman would argue we haven't done it enough, or I guess the Americans haven't done it enough, and you will get this outcome. It is pretty much a given. Is it pretty much a given?
Sure, you can get whatever you want in the short run. So, in that sense, I suppose it's a given. I think the challenge, and I think Paul would concede this as much as I think certainly anyone else, that the trouble is we don't know what we don't know. The unanticipated consequences of epically low interest rates in a sort of synchronized global wave of stimulus that's unprecedented in modern capitalism, it has to have unanticipated consequences, and whether that shows up in commodities, sovereign crises, a loss of faith in the dollar, problems in commercial real estate, we just don't know. So the trouble we get into is that what short-term benefit we're trading off against what long-term problem. And again, this goes to the very heart of economics. Our inability to answer that question in any kind of credible and convincing way for policymakers makes it easy to make that short-term decision and say, let's ramp up the stimulus and hold interest rates at these epically low levels, because we simply don't know what the other side of it looks like, and without being able to stand up and say what the risks look like, everybody can get away with pretty much anything they want.
Ken Rogoff, which statement that I'm about to make is more accurate in your view? Politicians use economists and economics wisely for the public good, or they use economists and economics for their own gain?
Oh boy, I'm so cynical. It's hard for me not to go with the second one. I have to say, speaking to what Paul just said, the problem, having spoken to many political leaders during the financial crisis, is, I think what he said was just absolutely right. We just don't know what's going to happen. I'm very nervous. I don't want to put tons more stimulus. But then they said, well, is it going to lead to a crisis? Is it going to be a problem? And you say, yeah, in 5 years or 10 years, it could be catastrophic if you keep doing this. And they just smile. They just laugh at you. I'm not here in 5 years. That's eternity. And that's a very hard message to deliver. When it looks good now, you spend the money, everybody's happy. There is an illusion that everything's normal now. And let me tell you, it is an illusion, because the governments have guaranteed everything. We have interest rates practically at zero. They're spending money like crazy. This can't last, and we need to, pull out of it. And I don't think politicians really want to face that day.
Dan, do you still see politicians and policymakers overly reliant on economics and economists in a way that obviously you wish they weren't?
Yes, I think so. Look, economics is very, very tempting. It's a beautiful way of looking at life. You have an answer for everything. You have a model that describes everything. You always know what people are going to do. You understand the incentives. You kind of have a really very general theory that can take different elements and strip them down to some forces and analyze what is going on. It's a very elegant way of looking at the world. Not correct, not complete, but very elegant. And I think the elegance is what actually is so eluding and intoxicating, and that's why, and it's easy to explain as well. If you come up with other theories, they could be much more difficult. So politicians are using it, and congressional staffers understand it and can explain it to other people. And if you look at, for example, the healthcare debate in the US or any kind of debate, you can see how much economic language there is in it. Even in the healthcare debate, it is not really, shouldn't be just about economics. These ideas have penetrated kind of the basic reasoning of everybody around, and because of it, it's just very comfortable to use it.
Diane, it's interesting. Every single economist I've ever talked to, or business leader in this country I've ever talked to, said cutting the GST, the goods and services tax in this country, by 2 points was the stupidest thing they'd ever seen. They thought it was terrible economics, terrible for our financial fundamentals, It's obviously exacerbated our deficit situation. There's only one economist in the whole country I know who thought it was a good idea, and he happens to be Prime Minister. What do you do when the political and the economic levers seem to line up in such an odd way like that? I mean, the fix is in some respects.
Well, the
isn't it?
fix is in, and again, I think we all have to be very careful to balance it with other opinions in the economic world. You know, economics is really not the point. It's human behavior, collective human behavior, swarming around numbers, anticipated numbers, real numbers, you know, jacking up the price of things, whether it's a New York condo or a piece of art or gold. And, you know, it's happening all over the world in different pockets in real time, and nobody can tell. I mean, when we had the debt crisis in August '07, all that money left the debt market, the credit markets, because we hit the wall there and went in to create this enormous commodities, food bubble. And that in turn helped us hit the wall faster. I mean, who knows where this money's going to go? It's all hot money and it's all moving in real time. So it's too complex, I think, for anybody to predict ever anymore.
Ken Rogoff, about a minute and a half to go here. Does the field of economics still, in your view, despite everything, have an authority that is unwarranted?
Well, that is unwarranted. It depends on the metric. I mean, I think economics has accomplished a lot, but obviously there does need to be rethinking, particularly of finance. This is a big event, like the Great Depression had a big effect on economics. This will. I mean, I think of it in a constructive way. Certainly, we need to look at history more and basic collecting of data, and Dan referred to the intoxicating theories. There was too much of that, and I think, you know, basic, raw, empirical research is important. I'm speaking because I've been doing that for a long time, but I do think we need to look at sort of the less glamorous parts of economics for answers to questions where we've had sexy theories, basically, that maybe didn't have so much to say.
Last 30 seconds to you, Dan Ariely, on that same comment.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, if you think about empiricism, empiricism is always right. You just look at how things behave, and you're not religious about what are the starting assumptions. The problem with economics is the assumption. But if you just focus on saying, look at how much we don't know, and before we're going to go and implement something, let's test it, let's figure out where the data is coming from, I think that's the path for a much better future.
It's good of all of you to join us tonight here on TVO. We're really grateful for your time. Paul Kedrosky from the Kauffman Foundation and editor of Infectious Greed from San Diego. Kenneth Rogoff in Boston, Massachusetts. His new book, which at 9 Eastern Time you can rush out and buy. This time is different. Dan Ariely, Durham, North Carolina, from Duke University. Predictably Irrational is the name of his book. Diane Francis, the National Post, distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University. Thanks so much to all of you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and a look at Keynesian economic theory, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program was produced by Mark Brosens and Melissa Martin, and you can read Melissa's post entitled Lessons in Economics. You'll find that on our Inside Agenda producers blog, also online at our homepage, tvo.org/theagenda.